Israel is accelerating construction of the new settlements on the occupied Palestinian territory throughout 2014, setting a 10-year record for the number of construction tenders issued. There were 4,485 tenders issued in 2014, a 20% rise from the previous year of 3,710. In 2007, there had been only 858. So these settlements are designed to prevent a Palestinian state ever being established. Prime Minister Netanyahu declared in the recent Israeli election campaign that, and I quote, "Whoever moves to establish a Palestinian state or intends to withdraw from the territory is simply yielding territory for radical Islamic terrorist attacks against Israel," end quote. And asked if he meant a state would not be established if he remained Prime Minister, he said, "Indeed." So even before the election, it was known that 60% of his cabinet were on record expressing opposition to a Palestinian state. Ladies and gentlemen, a solution must be found, and Israel has a clear responsibility to restoring dignity to the Palestinian people. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had once said, and I quote, "The lack of peace and the occupation that began in '67 continue to deprive the Palestinian people of dignity and self-determination. This is unacceptable and ultimately it is unsustainable," end quote. And in June 2009, in his Cairo address, President Obama said, Israelis must acknowledge that just as Israel's right to exist cannot be denied, neither can Palestine's. Palestine is once again at a crossroads, and the question is where to from here. So ladies and gentlemen, I do welcome you here today. I just want to give you a layout of this afternoon's conference. We have 5 speakers. Each speaker will have 30 minutes. Within that 30 minutes, they can speak for 20 minutes or up to 25 minutes, and the time remaining will be question time. So the first speaker that I will be called upon is Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees. But before he comes up, Professor Stuart Rees comes up, I would like to read a short bio on him. Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees, AM, to state the obvious, he's a very well qualified academic, holding a Bachelor of Arts with honours, a Diploma of Social Studies, a Certificate of Social Casework, and a Doctorate of Philosophy. For over 20 years, Stuart has been a Professor of Social Work and Social Policy at the University of Sydney. He was also elected Fellow of the Senate at Sydney University for 4 years. His awards include a Simon Fellowship at the University of Manchester, a Humanities Fellowship at the City University of Hong Kong, an honorary doctorate, an award of highest honour for contributions to world peace conferred by Soka University. In 2005, he was awarded a membership of the Order of Australia for services to international relations, particularly as Director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at Sydney University. Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees will address the topic, the power of language in the Palestine political struggle for a homeland. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rees.
Thank you, Shaoquett, and thank you for inviting all of us to come and scratch our heads about this important topic. I acknowledge standing on Indigenous people's land. I acknowledge their stewardship of this land in the past and the present, and look forward to our joint responsibility for the future. I say that because we are also talking today about the predicament of another Indigenous people. Now, I've been asked to talk about the power of language in the Palestinian political struggle for a homeland. And I always like, I'm just telling a student friend of mine, Shamik, please, no more detail. I don't want any more detail. I want to see what the essential thesis is. And I really want to divide the language into that which is mostly violent in the struggle and that which is mostly non-violent. That which is mostly exclusive and that which has the potential to be inclusive. I can go through all the detail, but That is how I'm going to approach this. I also think it's important to know that language does not only refer to words. It refers to the way you dress, the scarves you wear, the hospitality you show, the music you like, the poetry you appreciate, the art that decorates your homes. So, language, I'm going to be largely talking about words because I haven't got any musical accompaniment or overheads of pictures. But just remember that the language of communication is it's crucial that it not be only about words. And my comrade, stride for stride, paces silent at my side, said the poet Houseman. In other words, silence is a contribution to language. And people like Scott Morrison have never heard that. Because they think that by keeping on speaking, almost speaking with your elbows, is an interesting metaphor, is a way to convince people. The language of violence has really been a language about the people of Palestine. We have to deal with this first, I think. It's a language of demonization and depreciation. They're words of ridicule. They are the language of violence. So you had Colonel Kemp here a few months ago saying, trying to argue that the Israeli Defense Forces were the most moral army in the world, which never killed civilians. And then Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday came taking his cue from the publication of the United Nations report on war crimes in the Gaza slaughter. I refuse to call it war. There's an interesting way of handling language. It was never a war. It was an organized, as with Operation Cast Lead, it was an organized slaughter, not a war. Netanyahu repeated this claim that the Orwellian claim that the Israeli army was the most, had the highest standard in the world. And then, unfortunately, a colleague of mine, in response to the controversy about the Kemp lecture, in response to the students chanting Free Palestine, Dr. Suzanne Rutland said that really means dismantling of the Zionist entity, which means genocide against Israel's Jewish population. Now, this notion that Israel is going to be abolished is a piece of the kind of fear-mongering which is going on all over the place at the moment. I mean, the discussion about terrorism, the discussion about security in Australia is just is appalling exercise in fear-mongering. Because if you're in fear, then you will be deferential to and grateful to the strong man who struts the stage. And at the moment, that's the Australian Prime Minister. Then you've got these two, I was going to say so-called, but I won't, two academics from Monash, I think, Mendes and Darrenford, who love to demonize the BDS movement. Biggest social justice movement around the world, almost taken for granted across American campuses, by European governments, certainly across trade union movements and churches and NGOs. But in cautious, conservative, frightened Australia, it's regarded by Mendes and Darrenford as malevolent, bigoted, taking a McCarthyist plunge into zealotry. So more concern with using language as a form of fear-mongering. Then, following the Kemp lecture, Kemp Schmozzle, the News Corporation sort of went into a frenzy of sort of masturbation, it seemed to me. And out of that, usually if you do that, you don't produce anything. Out of that came articles that said that Sydney University there was mob rule at Sydney University. A demonstration that lasted 15 minutes meant, according to News Corporation, that mob rule prevailed. and that around the divine said the totalitarians were in charge. Right? And then somebody called Jeremy Jones, who, we're talking about language, this is a guy who loves the sound of his own voice. He said that BDS, you could hear him being absolutely fascinated by his command of alliteration. He said it was a magnet for the malicious and a podium for prejudice. And he must have shown it to his wife and then rubbed himself on the chest and congratulated himself. I want to go now to the context in which this denigration occurs. The context, if you go to East Jerusalem, is of appalling violence. The increased number of house demolitions, evictions. It's what our dear friend Jeff Harper calls atavistic revenge. You know, how do you maintain your life on a planet, and we're only here for 5 minutes, as far as I know, if you're concerned with revenge? Doesn't do your soul any good, doesn't do your mental health any good, doesn't do your physical health any good. He said, he reminded us that it violated every article in the Geneva Convention, particularly Article 33, relative to the protection of civilians in time of war. And he observed right-wing settler slogans in the streets of East Jerusalem: a Jew is a blessed soul, a Palestinian is the son of a whore. I know we have our version of that here, ditch the bitch. So we're not averse to thinking that this language of the bully in the playground is the right currency for politics. We're not averse to that at all. Then Diana Bhutto, dear Diana Bhutto, the distinguished Palestinian lawyer, talking about these events, said it was almost with tears, it's the most devaluing, the most humiliating period of her life. She said, I constantly hear that Palestinian people do not value life, but we only have a culture of martyrdom. And Gideon Levy, wonderful, brave Gideon Levy from Haaretz, on the Jewish nation state, talks about the idea that Palestinians should only be second-class citizens. And even the president of Israel, quite a brave man in many respects, Reuven Rivkin, wrote about 2 months ago in the New Yorker, it is time to honestly admit that Israel is sick. I am not asking if we've forgotten how to be Jewish, but if we've forgotten how to be human. So how to be human, not a bad cue for all of us. And let's come now to the point about the language of non-violence, the language of aspiration, the language of vision and hope. And it's really it's the language of non-violence. There's a Mahatma Gandhi, the greatest man never to win the Nobel Peace Prize, said non-violence was not only a way of living, but a law for life. That's why I said earlier that language was about hospitality, about music, about poetry, about art, about the way you dress, etc. The language is there for all of us with regard to the struggle for the Palestinian nation state. It's written in the highest aspirations of common men and women, namely in the Charter of the United Nations. That's where the language is. It talks about the responsibility to establish permanent, friendly relations with your neighbours, between countries. It talks about equal rights. It talks about the entitlement of the self-determination of all peoples. You can hear the language. Now, to his enormous credit, in April of this year, Mahmoud Abbas signed 15 international treaties to match those aspirations. They included the Convention on the Political Rights of Women. I almost feel I need to repeat that 10 times to all my Palestinian friends. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. He signed the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and of course the Treaty for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Signing of those treaties is important. It's more than symbolism, but the symbolism is important if it gives us some indication of where what sort of state Palestine might be. It's clearly got to be a state which takes the steps down the road to reconciliation. And some of them, I mean, every time you open a newspaper or certain, no, I'd rephrase that, not a newspaper. Every time you look at good bits of the social media, that's different. You pick up the cues for the sort of stuff I wanted to talk about, so that the wonderful Rabbi Michael Lerner from San Francisco, who runs Tikkun magazine, brilliant piece of work, wrote a piece today which I could have been a complete fraud and just read his article and pretended that I wrote it. And because he talked about dealing with racism in America, but he also referred to the racism that has become, unfortunately, a foundation piece of the Israeli state. The demeaning of an entire group of people and refusing to see them as fully human. So the steps towards reconciliation are going to be crucial. In the first case, you're always going to be reframing the issues. You do that in your families. Probably, maybe everybody here has never been involved in a family conflict. If so, you can all leave at this point. See, nobody left, nobody moved. You know that you have to reframe the issues. You have to find the space and the time to scratch your heads and redefine what the issues are really about. Clearly, Hamas and Fatah have to build bridges, have to have dialogue for the simple reason that it makes your life more interesting. I don't want to be more ambitious than that. If you are making your life more interesting, the chances are you're going to be taking steps towards reconciliation. You don't listen to bad music, you don't like to eat bad meals, you don't like awful doggerels, which some people call poetry. You'll want to make things more interesting. Clearly, the tolerance within Palestinian society has got a long way to go, in particular with regard to the treatment of women. You can't talk about taking your cue from the Charter of the United Nations and restrict the roles of women. This implies, I think, and this could apply to any religion, because some of the religions are an enormous obstacle to reconciliation, despite the claims they make. This means, I think, that leaders of Islam have got a desperate need to modernize in tandem with the Roman Catholic Church, in tandem with the Anglicans and all the others who've seen, unfortunately, violence as a way to run things. Now, what I want, and clearly the reconciliation has got to, and I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes, because academics speaking too much is also a form of violence. Clearly there has to be reconciliation with Israel. Or rather, Israel, in the wonderful Ilan Pappy's words, has got to not only acknowledge the Nakba, but has to acknowledge that it loves to victimize people even as it claims to be the victim. It has got to recognize the equality of all human beings, the dignity of all human beings, the main thread that led to the crafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I really want to pinch a few ideas from the great philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who told us about the social contract. If the Palestinian leadership, I mean, this sounds a bit patronizing from some white man standing on a stage saying this sort of thing. Clearly there has to be a contract between government and governed. A contract about equality, a contract about an end to poverty. And now I say this knowing that, for example, in Gaza at the moment, people are struggling to survive. That's an important caveat. I'm going to finish with some poetry, mostly from Mahmoud Darwish, because the wonderful English poet Shelley said that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, meaning that the multi-dimensional aspects of poetry, as opposed to prose, give you a vision and a picture and a sense of hope that you won't achieve from an ordinary sentence. And if you listen to these poets, and I'm just going to read a couple of quotes, you'll get the point. The first one comes from a book, you can tell, books that is falling to bits, you can tell how much I like it. It's from the crazy American eccentric poet Marion Moore. We need a great deal more eccentricity all over the place to break the boundaries of the way we think. So if you want to take one word away from me, it would be eccentricity. Here's a poem about courage, because we desperately need courage in public life to articulate what the alternatives are with regard to Palestine. It's called Blessed is the Man, or could be Blessed is the Woman, because I saw Alice squirming at that point, which I said, Blessed is the man, who does not sit in the seat of the scoffer, the person who does not denigrate, depreciate, denunciate, who is not characteristically intemperate, who does not, you say, listen to this, and apply it to what goes on in Canberra, who does not excuse, retreat, equivocate, and will be heard. And then she's got a wonderful phrase. She said, blessed the geniuses who know that egomania is not a duty, which I rather like. That's a kind of seminar discussion point, isn't it? She goes on to say, and this is about the leadership, not just leadership of the nation state, but in any small group. Blessed is the person who takes the risk of a decision, asks himself the question, would it solve the problem? Is it right as I see it? Is it in the best interests of all? I mean, what a massive political question that is. We've forgotten about the common good because we're all encouraged under the freedom of the market to screw our neighbour for every penny we can get. Please tell the people of Palestine, don't imitate the market. Don't borrow money from Goldman Sachs, sorry. Different form of language. Then she finishes, this is blessed is the person, blessed is the leader who's got some guts. Blessed is the author who favours what the supercilious do not favour, who will not comply. Blessed the unaccommodating man. I'll finish, you've got the message. So I'll finish up with wonderful, brilliant, inspiring Mahmoud Darwish, and Ahmed Sibul could read it in Arabic, I can't. This is from a poem from Beirut, where he imagines he wants to build Palestine even out of stone. I carry language docile as a cloud. Above the pavement of reading and of writing, the sea has left its eyes with us and gone back towards the sea. Incidentally, some of the best Israeli poets, like Yehuda Amichai, are actually saying the same things. So if we want to talk about reconciliation, you'd get the inspiration from the great Israeli poets as well as the Palestinian ones. Then the final Mahmoud Darwish, it's called We Travel Like Other People. We travel like other people, but we return to nowhere. As if travelling is the way of the clouds. We have a country of words, speak, speak, so we may know the end of this travel. So I finish with that, but I always like to finish with the wonderful, inspiring dictum of Bertrand Russell, founder of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, one of the great humanitarian protesters of the 20th century. He said, look, all you've got to do is remember humanity and forget the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that insightful contribution on the power of language, and of course your comments about the rights of women. It's very timely as well. So I want to thank Professor Stuart Rees. We do have 10 minutes, so if I will pass the microphone around If anybody would like to ask questions, please do raise your hand. And the questions will be obviously limited. I can see Sam Usmo and the gentleman in the back and the lady here. So that's 3. We'll keep to those. If there's any more time, we'll come back to them. We'll come around to Sam Usmo.
Thanks, professors, for your...
Do you need the microphone?
No, that's fine.
Okay, well, can you stand up and speak louder, please?
My question is, amidst the ocean of despair and the tsunami of violence that is being, the Palestinian people has been subjected to for years, have we, citizens living in Western democracies, under the Westminster system of government, continue to believe the Israelis' rhetoric, discourse, and language too far away from humanity? Isn't it time for all of us, those who oppose and those who really claim to be friends of Israel, to shake them a bit and say to them, all what you need to do is to be human? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and, those of you behind the question that didn't hear it, the question is, it's a very good question. It's about whether isn't there a sense of despair when the language of the mainstream is not unduly critical of Israel. What do we in so-called Western democracies, how do we respond to this sense of despair? How do we respond to the notion that Israel's almost certainly going to be right, almost certainly will have the support of News Limited and establishment people and parties? Is that a reasonable summary of the question? Okay. Well, look, I'm a believer in the philosophy of small victories. You have to have small victories in order to get up in the morning. Because if you don't have small victories, you'll be taken over by the fatalism that says we can't do anything. So, for example, I went to buy a sandwich at lunchtime, and I met this guy in a very popular cafe who hadn't seen me for some time, and he saw me wearing this. He asked me what it was about, and he said he knew nothing. He said, "What's this Israel-Palestine? What's that about?" Well, 15 minutes later, he was still transfixed to his sandwich stand, because he got his mobile phone out and started to say, "Christ, I didn't know any of this." So I said, "Well, you have an obligation to tell all your mates this." So, of course, we can't do anything alone. We have to learn the language of inclusion, we have to learn the language of non-violence, we have to learn the language of universal human rights, and we do it in solidarity with people like yourself. Then it's fun, because if it's fun, people are going to want to be in it, and they're going to repeat it.
Thank you. The next question is up there, the way, up there, gentleman there.
Hi, Rashid Kazal.
Can we limit the questions to actual questions without comments, so that we can use the time? Thanks.
Hi,
Tony Jones.
as I'm sure you're aware, the Labor Party at the next national conference are going to put a vote to change the party platform on Palestine. I just suppose I want to ask you what importance you put to that, or words without corresponding actions simply meaningless.
So whether it's important, do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, given that the Labour Party has mostly been cowardly on this issue for too long, or it has 50 cents each way and pretends that it's a supporter of Israel and a supporter of Palestine but does nothing, then even the vote which was regarded as, in Australian terms as a great achievement when they managed to abstain.
That was me.
Oh, it was you. They managed to, sorry, the Australian Labour Party. Look, you have to practice courage. That's what that poem was about. Blessed the unaccommodating man. Don't accommodate to what News Limited tells you, what the bullies or what the cowards in the media would do. I think it's symbolic, but I think it's very important.